Good Mayid. Today's Shir, Wednesday, Yud Nissen, will be on the seventh Pedic of Hilchas Mechirah. It's a very involved Pedic. And of course, in the 15-20 minutes that we have, we can't do justice. But I will try to give a slight overview of a very, very negeidik, very relevant halacha even today. The Rambam talks about the concepts of trust and whether somebody can back out of a deal, what is the geder, what is the outcome of an agreement, etc., etc. So the Rambam begins by saying, somebody who gave somebody else, a buyer gave a seller money, but he didn't take the object, he didn't take the fruits into his possession, even though the movable objects were not yet acquired, like we explained, because money doesn't acquire metaltalin. Whoever, since there was somewhat of a act of a, we'll try to explain it in our shir what exactly happened over here. Whoever backed out of the deal, the buyer or the seller, didn't do a Jewish act, didn't act like a Jew. Very harsh statement. You obligated to receive, the Bezin will give him what's called a Mechirah, which is, for lack of another description, a curse. Mechirah midaramabu, whoever, the God that paid, exacted punishment from the generation of the flood, he will exact punishment. It's a very, very terrible klala. Whoever gave, even if a person gave a little bit of money, a security deposit, whoever goes back on the deal gets a Mechirah. And then the Rambam continues to describe what exactly the Mechirah is, and later on the Rambam in halacha in halacha vav, the Rambam says, however, if you only agreed on something, and they agreed on a price, and the buyer made a certain description on the barrel, etc. That he should have a siman, a sign that it's his, even though he didn't give money. He cannot go back on it. Now, then the Rambam goes in halacha ches. There's a reason I'm saying all these halachas, because otherwise it will be hard to understand even the minimal shir that I'm about to give. If a person discusses the issue, discusses the act of acquisition, it's worthy, he should keep his word. Even though it was only a discussion and he didn't take any money, and he didn't he didn't make any signs like we described in the previous halacha, which the Shulchan Aruch calls a kinyan situmta, which is the act of acquisition that business people usually do in these scenarios. It's not a kinyan that the Rabbanan made or minatayra. It didn't make a security deposit. Even though he's not obligated to receive this terrible curse that we described in the beginning, he is somebody who is lacking of trust. Can't trust him. And the sages, the chachamim, are not happy with this person. Okay, of course, and then the Rambam continues again to elaborate on this. For lack of a better way to describe these halachas, let's go with a very practical question that the poskim talk about in a very contemporary fashion. Somebody advertised his car for sale, and he found a buyer. And after they had an oral agreement on the sale, a second person came and offered the seller a higher price. Is the seller permitted to back out of the first oral deal that he made with the first buyer and sell it to the second person? Very simple question. So number one, we have to realize in all of these types of questions, whether there was a kinyan over here, whether there was an active acquisition that the Torah describes effectuates a sale. So the kinyan, of course, is the transfer between one person, the ownership of one person, to the ownership of another person. After that kinyan is effectuated, whatever the kinyan is, whatever the kinyan of acquisition, you may be familiar with the kinyan of a week ago of Mechirah Chametz, kinyan Sudar. After that kinyan, everybody agrees that you cannot back out of a sale, because that's the strength of a kinyan. That's what a kinyan accomplishes. A kinyan accomplishes that the sale is done. The Shulchan Aruch paskins that when a buyer receives the object into his possession, the kinyan is complete and nobody could retract. However, if there was no kinyan, technically both parties can retract the situation. If the buyer paid money, even though we know, all of us that learn Gemara, that kinyan kesef is a biblical kinyan, nevertheless the Chachamim abolished this kinyan for various reasons. You would think that paying money is the best solution, but according to Torah law, according to Gemara, rabbinic law, kinyan kesef does not validate a kinyan. So therefore, technically, even though the buyer paid the seller money, technically the seller can violate the kinyan. However, in this case, in the case of giving money, even though it's not a valid kinyan, now we get into this issue of the curse of Mechirah. But in the original case that we mentioned about the oral agreement to sell a car, since the buyer didn't give the money, there is no Mechirah. The Mechirah doesn't even begin. This is a general overview of the halachas that the Rambam is talking about in this halacha. However, there are situations where even though there was not a valid kinyan, and there was not a Mechirah, which is the buyer didn't bring it into his possession, nevertheless, the poskim, the halachic decisors, have ruled that both parties cannot retract. If they did what's called what the Rambam calls Reishim, which I said is called the Kinyan Situmta, if they did something that business people in the area, the custom of business people was to do such a Kinyan, and this is what the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch bring down. Reishim alayayin, they make a certain sign on the barrels of wine that these are my barrels, and this validates the Mechirah. This validates the Mechirah. So again, in our case that we began the discussion with, the oral agreement to sell or to buy a car, there was no reishim, there was no situmta, there was nothing to happen. There was an oral agreement that I'll sell you the car for $5,000. You'll buy the car for $5,000, and so there is no valid kinyan. However, so therefore the seller can back out if somebody offers them a bigger price technically. However, now we're getting into a much more fluid question, whether what's called whether the Chachamim looked at this with an ayin yafa, with a good eye, whether they were approving of such a situation. And this is the basis of our short shir today, whether in this case that we described, there was no situmta, there was no ration, there was no kinyan, but there was some type of a verbal agreement, whether the seller can back out, or even later, in a certain case, the buyer can back out. Let's say the buyer found the same car for a cheaper price, and he decides to dump the seller, whether he could do it or not. So the Gemara says in the famous Gemara in Bava Mechirah, if somebody just, you're having a discussion about Naisav and Naisin, you're having this nice banter back and forth, the Gemara says, but how is somebody who goes back on such an agreement, the sages, the Chachamim are not happy with such a person, and but again, the ability to retract is there. Just to now, there's a machlekes between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan in the Gemara, whether an oral law constitute, in other words, an oral agreement, which is without any act of kinyan or without any giving of money, whether this itself constitutes mechusrei emana, lack of faith, or the lack of being called a trustworthy person. Rabbi Yochanan says that it is. Rav argues. Most poskim hold like Rabbi Yochanan. However, and they write, most poskim write that not only is the halacha like Rabbi Yochanan that he is mechusar emana, but it's usur. It's prohibited to do this. The Rambam that we're learning today, the Rambam is unique in the fact the Rambam writes in halacha ches. We read it at the beginning of the shir. If somebody has a discussion only orally, it's worthy. It's not an iser. Taisvis and other Rishonim learn that it's usher to retract from your words. The Rambam doesn't go so far. The Rambam learns it's only ro'i lamed b'diburei. A person should keep his word. The Mechirah says harsh words, that somebody who violates such an agreement is eine oise maise amcha. He doesn't act like a Jew. It's very harsh word. It says also, brings down another pasuk, she'eris Yisrael lo yasu avla. Jewish people shouldn't do such things. They shouldn't. They shouldn't speak falsely. And so, and the fact that the Mechirah brings down that pasuk shows that it's at least an Isser Medivre Kabbalah, which is also a very difficult thing. The Mordechai goes even further. The Mordechai says that somebody who doesn't keep his word violates a pasuk in the Torah, hin tzedek, hin shulchat tzedek, etc. However, again, the Rambam learns that it's only rovi, so it's a good thing to do. The commentaries say an interesting thing. There's a concept of hachraza. There's a concept of hachraza, like for going. Let's say in the serious case, in the case of mishapara, where a person is supposed to get a mishapara, we don't just give him a mishapara in Bezdin, which is the Bezdin pronounces a terrible curse, Rahman al-Litzlan, but there's a concept of hachraza. You have to announce that Pliny ben Pliny received, this person received the terrible curse of a mishapara, and that people should know that he's such a person. So the commentaries write on the lower level, where there's no mishapara, where there's only a mechusar amana, the commentaries write that also it should be announced similar to, just like there's a requirement to publicize that he received a mishapara. Certain Rishonim learn that there's a chiyuv there's a chiyuv to announce that he is such a person as Mechusar Emana, and the Achronim talk about whether, and the Rambam brings this down to Gabi Mishapara, but since he doesn't bring it down to Gabi Mechusar Emana, they say that there is no such requirement, but there are commentaries that learn in the Rambam that even such a person, even on a Mechusar Emana, you have to announce it. This is very serious stuff, because basically, if every business is based on trust, if the person is a trustworthy person or not, for example, regarding rules of Lashon Hara, can a person, if we want to do business with somebody and we ask somebody who knows him well, he's obligated to say, listen, you're asking me, I'm telling you, this person backed out of a deal and he got a mishapara. This person backed out of a deal, an oral deal, and he's mechusar emana. You can't trust him. It's a very serious thing. Who would want to do business with somebody that the chachamim write he's mechusar emana? Okay. There's an okay. According to some opinions, Maram Rottenberg writes that this person is allowed to be called a Rasha, which is, again, a very serious appendage to call somebody a Rasha, that you're allowed to call somebody a Rasha. And the commentaries write whether, according to the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, this is valid or not. So you can see how these issues are being dealt with by Diukim in the Rambam. Okay, so again, we'll keep it short and we'll go to another point. We like to always interject a flavor of lumdis into the discussions that we have. So the Achreinim deal with this issue. What is the Isser over here? What is the prohibition of Mechusar Emana, or even Mishapara, backing out of a deal, backing out of an oral agreement, etc., whether it's an Isser mitzad de Gavra? What does this mean? This means that the person has to be a person of his word. A person who promised to sell a car at a certain price, he has to keep his word. He not so much mitzad the din of Geneva or Dinei Mamanis, but more that a person should act and should conduct himself in an honest way. He shouldn't get used to being a liar. He shouldn't get used to being somebody who you cannot trust. That if a person gave his word on something, he's not a good person. That's the Isser Gavra. Or, however, maybe the point over here being that maybe the point is that the reason that you have to keep your word is because the other person relies on you. There's a certain halachic implication. Not so much the chefza, but the person. It's not so much that the Torah cares about the person making the promise. It's more about whether the deal will. If I rely on the fact that you're going to sell me the car, so I'm not going to go and look for another car. I may miss other opportunities, or the person may cause pain to another person. So, for example, the commentaries talk about various things, whether there's mechusar emana by a non-Jew, by a minor, by a matana, by different things. So the Rambam, right, from the wording of the Rambam, that the Rambam writes, Ra'ui la'adam, the commentaries write that this is only the point of mechusar emana is not so much of a halachic status, but it's because it's a lack of smichas das, meaning that when there is no kinyan, when there is no active acquisition, when no money is translated, it's only words, it's mere words. So even the buyer or the person on the other side, he doesn't take it serious. There's no smichas das of the makabel, and therefore we really don't take him serious. Interestingly enough, the Alter Rebbe in Hilchos Mechirah, The Alter Rebbe in Hilchos Mechirah deals with this issue. It's the Hilchos Mechirah Umatana Sivvav, and he takes a very serious approach to this, and also based on the Ramah that we shouldn't. The Ramah paskins lahalacha, and he uses the words of the Rambam. Ramah paskins that even though there was no money changing hands, and he's not getting a mishapara, says the Ramah, he paraphrases the Rambam, a person should keep his word even though there was no kinyan and it's only words. The chachamim are not happy from it. And the Alter Rebbe writes also very sharply, very strongly, and the commentaries say that this is based on the Rambam. That he says that if a person promises to do something, and it's a small thing that other people rely on, he cannot back out. So again, it's a little bit of a lengthy issue. The commentaries on the Alter Rebbe write that even though why does the Alter Rebbe make a difference between a matana muetas and a matana meruba, or davar muet and davar meruba? Because when it's something big, the purchaser or the receiver doesn't really rely on it unless there's an actual active kinyan. However, if it's a small thing, he does rely on it. So that leads us to the maskana. Again, it's a lengthy issue. It doesn't do justice. So the commentary is right that, let's say, a person in our story that we began, the question that we began about the oral agreement to sell a car, as long as they didn't agree on a price and on the details. So technically, since it's a big item, it's a big thing, there was no smichas das, there was no real following, a real assurance that they're going to follow through with it. So lechatchila, you could go. Technically, you could back out. The buyer and the seller could back out. But if there was a detail, if there was no detail, again, I want to repeat, if there was no real detail of they didn't. Okay, I'm sorry. I want to make sure I'm clear, because I don't want to misspeak. If there was an agreement to buy and sell a car, but there was no details of the price, and there was no details of like how you're going to pay, etc., it was very up in the air. So everybody agrees that you can back out. There was no agreement on price. There was no agreement on how long it's going to take to pay me. It was a theoretical sale. You can back out. If there was an agreement between the buyer and the seller, and they agreed even on a price, so then neither of them can back out of the deal. And according to the Alter Rebbe, according to the Rambam, in such a case, he's called a mechusar amana. He is somebody you can't trust him. And but he could back out. He could back out. If he's willing to be called somebody who has no rabbinic trust, he can back out. If there was some type of a kinyan or some type of a deposit, so then that's a much more serious issue. And then in the times where there was a bezdin, there would be a mishapara. What remains, what is talked about at length, and it's not something that I'd like to go into now due to the shortness of the shiur. If, let's say, there was extenuating circumstances and somebody offered the seller a lot more money, he agreed to sell it at 5,000, and somebody came and offered him 8,000 or 10,000, or the other way around, the seller was able to buy the same car for 3,000, etc. So there are those poskim that say that in such a case, there was no smichas das, there was no tremendous assurance that he's going to sell it or buy it, and it was a unintended gift that came, or an unintended windfall that came to the buyer or the seller. So in such a case, there are those that are making. Have a good Mayed, and we'll see you next week.